من ثياب النار وسرابيل القطران فلا تلبسنا ومن كل سوء يا لا إله إلا أنت بحق لا إله إلا أنت فنجنا. اللهم إني أسألك أن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر من الأمر المحتوم في الأمر الحكيم من القضاء الذي لا يرد ولا يبدل أن تكتبني من حجاجك حجاج بيتك الحرام المبرور حجهم المشكور سعيهم المغفور ذنوبهم المكفر عن سيئاتهم، وأن تجعل فيما تقضي وتقدر أن تطيل عمري في خير وعافية وتوسع في رزقي وتجعلني ممن تنتصر به لدينك ولا تستبدل بي غيري. أعوذ بجلال وجهك الكريم أن ينقضي عني شهر رمضان أو يطلع الفجر من ليلتي هذه ولك قبلي تبعة أو ذنب تعذبني عليه. وصلى الله على محمد وآله الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على
محمد وآل محمد وعجل فرجهم. أحسن الله عليكم inshallah. For the sponsors of today's iftar, for all the marhumeens, all the marhumeen of the world, especially those in occupied lands of Palestine. رحم الله من قرأ الفاتحة مع الصلوات. صلي على محمد وآل محمد. Also, Shokat's dear mother is not so well. Inshallah, we read together the Ayah Al-Karima. اللهم إني نسألك وندعوك باسمك العظيم الأعظم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أمن يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف السوء. 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 يا الله نحن مضطرون ففرج عنا بحق محمد وآله الطاهرين.
اللهم صل على محمد وآله. Please open your Qur'ans to chapter number 4, verse number 3. We will also be reading from verse 1 and 2. Surah An-Nisa, chapter number 4, verse number 1, 2, and 3. But our main discussion will be on ayah number 3, but we will need all the preceding ayat as well, inshaAllah. For the love of the Holy Prophet Muhammad, one loud salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين. الحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين خاتم النبيين سيدنا الممجد بشير المصدق المصطفى الأمجد محمود الأحمد أبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين ولعنة الله على الظالمين من الأولين والآخرين أما بعد فقد قال الله سبحانه وتعالى في كتابه المجيد وقوله الحق بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم وإن خفتم أن لا تقسطوا في اليتامى فانكحوا ما طاب لكم من النساء مثنى وثلاث ورباع آمنا بالله صدق الله العلي العظيم صلوا على محمد وآل محمد. Awaited Savior of humanity, Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam, my respected teachers, elders, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum jami'an wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Amongst the most misunderstood and critiqued verses of the Holy Quran is chapter number 4, verse number 3, in which the ayah appears to give general permission for man to have multiple wives. The ayah says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ. And if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, then marry such women as seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. The ayah suggests the permissibility of polygamy and is heavily criticized from outside the Muslim world and even from inside the Muslim world as well. Outside the Muslim world, those who see a problem with polygamy as immoral or unjust, they raise this ayah as a critique against Islam to demonstrate that the ideas of Islam are thus flawed because the Quran permits or appears to permit the general permissibility of polygamy. Inside, there is also a growing question from both women and men as to why Islam would permit polygamy or appear to encourage polygamy, and how that really affects the relationships of people in their marriages until today. Tonight, inshallah, we want to be able to discuss this verse in such a way that helps us to be able to understand the context behind the verse, and also the major different opinions regarding this ayah. From the perspective of the vast majority of the Muslim scholarship, both Sunni and Shia, the opinion is that this verse gives general permissibility to polygamy. A very small, minute portion of the Muslim Ummah scholarship believes that this ayah is not giving general permissibility towards polygamy, but is actually focused on a particular context. I would argue that in terms of the history of Islamic scholarship, it is probably in the proportion of something like 99 or 98% of Muslim scholarship that believes this ayah gives general permissibility for polygamy up to 4 wives. Maybe 1 or 2% differ and argue it is saying something actually a little bit different. Tonight, inshallah, I will try to explain both opinions. Where does the opinion arise and why do they differ? The reason as to why they differ is the following. Those who take the majority position that this is giving general permission for anyone, any man, to be able to have a polygamous relationship, they look at the ayah, chapter number 4, verse number 3, in isolation of what comes before it. They only focus on verse number 3 itself. Those who object and differ say that we have to be able to see verse number 3 in the context of verse number 2, verse number 2 in the context of verse number 1. And only when you accurately understand the siyaq of the ayah, the internal coherence, and the relationship between one part of the sequence to the next part of the sequence, are we in a better position to understand what verse number 3 is specifically talking about. This is the only verse of the Quran that addresses the issue of polygamy. There are many, many other ahadith that go into the ideas, the permissions, the limitations, the issues surrounding it. From our perspective as a discourse tonight, we're not going into those ahadith, the other issues that surround it. We are only looking at explaining this verse and making sure that we understand the traditional Muslim view and also the minority Muslim view that helps us at least to have our own correct understanding. And then if ever someone asks you about it, at least you have the understanding of the ayah itself. So inshallah tonight, the first thing we will do is look through the traditional opinion and then go to a different opinion, and maybe you will be able to come up with your view as to which one that you agree with. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. Muslim scholarship and their techniques of tafsir of Quran has always evolved and is continuing to evolve. This is a requisite point to understanding this verse. If you go back into the techniques of our commentators and exegetes of the Quran 1,000 years ago, they do differ in many ways with the way in which commentators understand them today. Previously, there was a very heavy reliance on ahadith to solely explain the meaning of the Quran without taking any recourse to other sciences. Today, of course, ahadith continues to play a central role in explaining the Quran. One of the ways that the techniques of tafsir has evolved is to now utilize what is known as the siyaq of the ayah, the internal coherence and the relationship between a verse or a set of verses. When you relate one part of an ayah to another, it should be that one part of the ayah is giving rise to the meaning of another part of an ayah. In fact, when you zoom out a step further, the preceding verses and the subsequent verses also have an impact on the particular verse that you are studying. When you zoom out even further, the coherence of the entirety of the surah also has to have an impact on the meaning of the one ayah that you are studying. And if you go further, zooming out, the entirety of the Quran must also have an impact on the relationship between the various different verses. This technique is a new technique, relatively speaking, in the ways in which commentators of the Quran, exegetes, are focused on understanding the meanings of verses. And tonight I'll show you how the reliance on only one verse completely differs with the reliance upon, say, 3 verses or 4 verses in the siyaq, in the coherence of the ayah. Please open your Qur'ans to chapter number 4, Surah An-Nisa, verse number 3, and we'll read the verse, and then I will explain the majority opinion of this verse and why it gives rise, in their opinion, to a general permission for adult men to be able to have multiple marriages, 1, 2, 3, or 4 permanent marriages at any one time. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَاعَ. And if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, then marry such women as seem good to you, 2 or 3 or 4. Now, the way in which they interpret this is the following. If you fear you cannot act equitably towards the property of the orphans. Instead of marrying orphans, marry other women. Marry your own wife, your second wife, a third, and a fourth. This is the traditional explanation by the Muslim scholarship. 99% of Muslim scholarship believes this is the meaning of it. If you cannot act equitably towards the property or towards orphans in marriage, then don't marry them. Instead, marry 1, 2, or 3, or 4 other women. Okay? Does everybody understand? This is the way in which scholarship normally explains the meaning of this verse. Now, in order to be able to explain, because it might be something missing, you're saying, well, what's this part of the verse got to do with that? Why, if I fear that I can't act equitably towards orphans, does Allah tell me I should marry 2 wives or 3 wives? I bring with you Tafsir al-Mizan by His Eminence Allama Sayyid Muhammad Hussain Tabatabai, rahmatullahi ta'ala alayh, one of the leading Shiite Mufassirin, to be able to read to you from his words, and you will see the way in which the Mufassirin connect these dots traditionally and what they mean by this particular ayah, why it gives rise, in their opinion, to a general permission for any man to be able to have 1, 2, 3, or 4 wives. So I'm reading to you. He says the following. He quotes the ayah. And if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, then marry such other women as seem good to you. So now I'm reading to you his words, quote from Sayyid Tabatabai. We have mentioned previously that there was always a great number of orphans amongst the Arabs of the era of ignorance, who were seldom free from war, fighting, murder, and forays, and among whom death by killing was a very common occurrence. Usually, the leaders of tribes and people of power and influence took the orphan girls with their properties as wives. They devoured the orphans' properties with their own and behaved unjustly with them. So what happened? Many orphans were created due to war, due to poverty, due to disease and sickness. When their parents died, they inherited their parents' properties, don't they? So the Arab men had a culture of marrying these young girls and then taking the property of the yatimat, the young girls, the women, the girl orphans, the young girl orphans, and devouring it for themselves, taking it for themselves. You understand? He continues, Sayyid Tabatabai continues. Often, they turned them out of their property. The men would marry them, take their properties, and then throw them out of the houses. The helpless girls became poverty-stricken destitutes. Neither they had any money to live on, nor was there anyone willing to marry and maintain them. The Quran has reproached the Arabs very severely for this habit and disgusting injustice, and prohibited very strongly doing any injustice to orphans or devouring their property. And then he gives other verses of the Quran where Allah prohibits the stealing of the property of orphans. Now this is the key part I want you to focus on. Pay attention to what Sayyid Tabatabai says as the explanation of the ayah that we're studying. As a result, the Muslims reportedly became afraid for their own souls and were so panic-stricken that they turned out the orphans from their own homes in apprehension, lest they inadvertently do something wrong with those orphans' property or fail to give them their just dues. If someone kept an orphan with him, he set apart the orphan's share in food and drink. If the orphan could not finish that food and drink, nobody else would touch it. It remained until it even became spoilt. The food was not touched until it even became spoilt. It caused great difficulties for the people, and they complained to the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wa until Allah revealed the ayah from Surah Al-Baqarah verse 220, set aright their affairs. Thus Allah allowed them to give shelter to the orphans and keep them with themselves for looking after their affairs and to mingle with them because they were their brethren. In this way, the difficulties were removed and their worries were dispelled. Do you understand? The Arab men used to marry the orphans. They used to plunder the wealth of the orphans, took it for themselves. Allah revealed verses prohibiting that. But the extent of the emphasis on looking after the wealth of the orphans became such a burden on the Muslims that they became so pedantic, according to this tafsir, they became so pedantic and worried about how they were dealing with the orphans' properties that it actually became more of a burden for them to marry orphans. They would set aside the property, they would be so scared to do anything because they felt that then they were going to be blamed by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, in this context, Sayyid Tabatabai says, when you ponder on this fact, and then you look at the verse under discussion, if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, instead marry another wife, or 2, or 3, or 4, it will become clear to you that the verse raises the prohibition of plundering the wealth of orphans to an even higher degree. Its connotation will become as follows. Be careful regarding the orphans, and do not substitute your bad or worthless property with their good ones, nor should you devour their property with your own, so much so that if you are afraid that you would not be able to treat the orphan girls equitably, and therefore you do not like to take them as wives, instead do not marry these orphan girls. Instead you should marry other women who seem good to you. 1, 2, 3, or 4. So do you understand now? Does everybody understand? That what they are arguing, the historical position, they believe, is that the Muslims were under so much pressure with how they were dealing with orphan girls that they didn't want to marry them anymore. And Allah revealed a verse saying, if you don't want this pressure of having to deal with the property of an orphan girl, instead don't marry the orphan girl, marry 2, 3, or 4 as you please. You understand? Is it clear? Yeah? Okay? So this is the historical position and is the vast majority of positions amongst the ulama, sunnatan wa shi'atan. There is an obvious set of problems with this. And we can probably raise maybe 3 or 4 problems with this interpretation, such that when we start to think about the ayah slightly differently, it's very plausible that you and I might come out with a very different understanding of this verse. Please open your Qur'ans. To the verse again, chapter 4, verse number 3. And I will try to raise with you the 3 or 4 points of dispute that should be raised to this position about the meaning of this ayah. Now, I will suggest, until now, all of you, whether or not you know the ayah well or you don't know the ayah well, probably all of you have heard that this is the sort of verse that gives permission to 4 wives. Right? And it's become sort of a prominent thing. It's become a throwaway idea that in Islam, man gets 4 wives, or is allowed 4 wives. And this is the verse that supports it. This is the verse that proves it. Does it? Is that actually what the verse is telling you? Let's discover it. What are the 3 or 4 problems with this interpretation? Number 1. Or not problems, but the issues that we raise with this. Number 1. The first issue is, prior to Islam, there was the practice in Arabia that men could have any number of wives that they wanted. There was no limits to them. 10, 20, it didn't matter. What this verse does is that it places limitations on men, bringing the number down, ideally to 1, if not 2, if not 3, then a maximum of 4 in a permanent marriage. Correct? So this is the first element of discussion that needs to take place. Second element of discussion that needs to take place is that the verse, in this explanation by Sayyid Tabatabai and all the other Muslim scholarship, appears to ignore the context of the previous 2 verses. There's no mention. How is verse 3 being explained by verse 2 and by verse 1? Sayyid Tabatabai here doesn't appear to go into it. And to be honest with you, the vast majority of Muslim scholarship also doesn't go into it. This is the second problem. Third problem is this. Please have a look at the verse, and I want you to pay attention with the Arabic, okay? And if you don't know the Arabic, I will explain the issue to you, inshallah. Please read the verse. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards the wealth of orphans, or towards orphans themselves, the rights that orphans have when you marry them, what should you do? فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ. Marry women as to whom you please. 1, 2, مثنى وثلاثة ورباع. 3 or 4. طيب. Please focus on the word yatama. Reread the verse. Just make sure you're focusing on this word yatama. Yatama. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans. Orphans here in the Arabic is pluralized to include male and female. In the Arabic language, the word yatim, male. Yatima, female. Yatimat, females, female orphans in their plural. Okay? Yatama is the plural for all, including male and female. Please pay attention. This is really important. The mufassirin of the traditional opinion have relegated the meaning of yatama to yatimat. They have explained the word yatama by translating it to mean yatimat. Let me explain. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards female orphans in marriage, then don't marry the female orphans. Marry 1, 2, 3, or 4 wives. Let me read to you again from Sayyid Tabatabai and explain it. You'll see the big problem with their interpretation. He says the following. When you ponder upon this verse, it will become clear to you that the meaning, its connotation is as follows. Look out for when he only specifies female orphans. He says the following. Be careful regarding the orphans, and do not substitute your bad or worthless properties for their good ones, nor should you devour their property with your own. So much so that if you are afraid that you would not be able to treat the orphan girls equitably, do not take them as your wives. Rather, marry such women as seem good to you, 2, 3, or 4. Did you notice? What does he say? If you are afraid that you would not be able to treat the orphan girls. Sayyid Tabatabai and the vast majority of Muslim scholarship has explained the word yatama as yatimat. So they have focused on marriage to yatim girls. Allah doesn't say that. This is actually a very big deal, because if you're going to explain the meaning of the Quran, you can't just relegate or narrow the meaning of a word from its generalized or its pluralized into a very specific, can you? Look at what the verse says. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, not orphan girls, but Sayyid Tabatabai, may Allah bless him, and all this other scholarship of Muslim opinion has said it means Muslim girls. But it doesn't. I'm going to come back to this in a minute, just so you note the problem. This is the third problem. So what was the first problem? Or the first issue? No limitations on how many wives you could have. This verse brings it down to a maximum of 4. Second issue, the verse only is taken in isolation and not in the context of the previous 2. Third problem we're going to raise with you is the scholarship has changed the meaning of word yatama to include men, boys, and excluded it in the meaning and focused on yatimat. Third problem. Fourth problem. Think about this very carefully. God is saying, there's a huge number of problems. We have loads and loads and loads of orphan children. Look after them. So now, apparently, Muslim men start to marry these orphan girls in order to look after them. And they're so worried about making mistake with the properties of the orphan girls. So they come to the Prophet ﷺ apparently and start complaining and say, this is too difficult for us. Apparently God is saying, instead of you actually making sure you learn how to deal with their properties fairly and justly, don't worry about them, don't get married to them, marry other women. Tell me, if all of a sudden the Muslim community left that practice of marrying and looking after orphan girls and boys and went and married others, 2, 3, and 4 of them, what happens to the orphan girls? Ahsant. Did you see earlier on, Sayyid Baab-Ul-Ilm said the big problem was that the orphan girls at the time of the Arabs, they used to get thrown out of their own houses. What happened? He says, this is prior to Islam. Often they turned them out of their own properties after swallowing them up. The helpless girls became poverty-stricken destitutes. Neither did they have any money to live on, nor was there anyone willing to marry and maintain them. What is the solution here? Allah appears to be saying, yeah, don't marry them, go and marry other women. So what happens to the orphan girls? Neglect. No chance for them to be maintained. No chance for them to get married. Why? Oh, because looking after their property is too difficult. Does that make sense to you? Does it make sense? Be honest, does it make sense to you, this explanation? It doesn't make sense to me. If we have to look after the property of an orphan and be very precise, then so be it. There should not be an encouragement by Allah to say, okay, well, if you're finding it too difficult, leave them and then marry other women. What's going to happen to these thousands, hundreds of thousands of orphans? Is this what Allah wants from us? Is this actually what the Prophet, Rahmatun lil Alameen, would do as a solution? Even today, when there are so many millions of orphans in the world, we have to be precise with their belongings, don't we? We don't shy away from it. We say we're responsible. And if you're going to be responsible, then you have to be just about it. You have to be careful about it. But no one says it's too difficult for you. Don't participate in the needs of the orphans. Bil-akis, the opposite. We say make sure you raise yourself to the level of adala. Make sure that you are just, precise. If you need support, we are here to help you. We don't discourage you. The Quran here, if you take this interpretation from Sayyid Baab-Ul-Ilm, is what? A whole verse came around to reveal and said, okay, don't marry them, instead marry 4 other wives. Really, brother? Is this what you think that the Quran is telling you? Is this a social system to look after yatimat? No, of course not. So here we raise 4 issues regarding this verse. Number 1, the limitation upon men by numbers. Number 2, that it's not got any context to the previous ayat. Number 3, there seems to be a mismatch between the way Allah uses the word yatama and the way the mufassirin have relegated to mean yatimat. And number 4, it appears that the verse is now discouraging us or not encouraging us to be able to be precise with the orphan's property and instead marry 2, 3, 4 or others, leaving these neglected. So let's go through this and see how the other side of Muslim scholarship is beginning to look at this ayah in a much more accurate way. Number 1, it is correct to say that there was no limitations on Arab men prior to Islam as to the number of wives that they could marry, permanently or otherwise. Does that mean that we have to jump to the conclusion that says that this verse is actually giving us a limitation on the number? Does A have to equal B here? You see what I mean? Just because there was no limitation before Islam, does it necessarily mean that this verse is giving a limitation to the number 4 in this verse? Doesn't necessarily mean it, does it? So we have to then figure out what the verse is saying in order to decipher whether it is actually a limitation to 2, 3, or 4. So we'll come back to that one. Second issue. We have to read the preceding ayat to be able to explain the meaning of verse number 3. Please read the verses with me. Open your Qur'ans, Surah An-Nisa, verse number 1. We'll read the ayats together, inshaAllah. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Ya ayyuhan nas. So it's an ayah addressing all of mankind. Not just Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu. Ya ayyuhan nas. اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء. O people, be careful of your duty to your Lord, who created you from a single being, created its mate of the same kind, and spread from these two many men and women. And be careful of your duty to Allah, by whom you demand one of another your rights, and to the ties of relationship. Surely Allah ever watches over you. Context of this ayah is, be careful of your duties to your various different relationships. There is a haqiqah behind your existence. You didn't drop from the sky. You are not from apes. There is a haqiqah, a reality behind where you have come from that comes from a single point of creation. Be careful of your duty regards to each other, husbands and wives, and in regards to arham, your familial relationships as well. Inna Allaha kana alaykum raqiba. Surely Allah is ever watchful over you. Verse number 2. وَآتُوا الْيَتَامَى أَمْوَالَهُمْ. And give to the orphans their property. So as we said, orphans are created. Why? Parents die from war, parents die from disease and such. And as a result, orphans inherit their property. Allah says, give over their property to them as is due to them. وَلَا تَتَبَدَّلُوا الْخَبِيثَ بِالطَّيِّبِ. And do not substitute worthless things for their good ones. Do not take your worthless things and give it to them and take their good properties and take it for yourself. Do not exchange what's good for what's bad. If it belongs to them, make sure that they have it. وَلَا تَأْكُلُوا أَمْوَالَهُمْ إِلَىٰ أَمْوَالِكُمْ. And do not devour their property as an addition to your own property. Don't take it as this is yours. Just because you've married them or you've taken to look after them, you don't take their properties as yours. It belongs to them. Just because you become their guardian doesn't mean it belongs to you now. إِنَّهُ كَانَ حُوبًا كَبِيرًا. Surely this is a great crime. Okay. I want you to just take a step back and think about this context for a second. Take the moment that we live in. There's been war in Iraq, war in Yemen, war in Syria, war in Afghanistan, war in Palestine. How many millions of aitam, orphans, do you think there are? Just give me understand the question. When war occurs, right now, how many, there's 1 million orphans in Iraq. How many are there in its entirety? Syria, uncountable. Afghanistan, 9 years of Saudi, British, American-led war on Yemen. Just now, in the last 5 months with the Zionist regime, the maniacal Zionist regime's bombing of Gaza, how many orphans do you think have been created? Tens of thousands. So understand, when war takes place, and in our era in lifetime, is that in the history of humanity, has there been an era when there's been no war? No. So in every era, let alone ours, in every era, orphans are innumerable. In the era in which we live in now, in the Muslim Ummah, probably orphans are a bigger number than any other point in the history of humanity. Would that be a fair assumption? probably we have more orphans now in the ummah than you could possibly remember at any other time. Because in every major country there's been ongoing war in the last decade or the last 2 decades. This is why you know so many brilliant charities are constantly coming to you and saying, can you please invest, sponsor an orphan, sponsor an orphan. You all know about the great work that charities do. Give to the orphans. Verse number 3. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. What does this mean? And if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, in what sense? Does the verse say orphans and being married to them? No. Does the verse say orphans and their wealth? It just says, if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans. Now, when the Quran speaks generally, it wants you to know it as general as possible. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards the needs of orphans, what are the needs of orphans? Is it only need to get married? What is the needs of orphans? You have their housing, you have education, you have all of the emotional needs that need to be there. You have all of the social norms that need to be looked after, hundreds of thousands, millions of orphans. If you fear that you cannot act equitably and look after the needs of orphans, فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. Then marry those women as to whom you please. These sets of ayat were revealed to create a social care system in the ummah for orphans and whom? Orphans and? Say again. How do you know that? What's the name of the surah? Surat? Remember what I said at the beginning of the discussion. The ayat cannot be taken in isolation of the surah itself. Allah has named the surah Suratan Nisa. He didn't name it Surat al-Rijal. He didn't name it Surat al-Yatim. He said Suratan Nisa. So the context is what? When you have an orphan and they lose their father, who else is there in the family? Who else is there in the family? The mother. The widow. So in this situation, when husband goes off to war, killed, who is left behind? Is it only the child, or is it child and mother? Which one? Go back to verse number 2. Very important. Look at verse number 1. End of verse number 1. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ. Arham is what? Siratur Rahim. What is Siratur Rahim? Looking after your blood relatives, the wider family unit. The context here is not simply orphans. It's orphans and their mothers, their widows. They have been left behind after war, after disease, after accident has happened. Look at verse number 3. وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى. If you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans and their needs. Doesn't say, hey, throw them out and don't marry them and neglect them. فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. Marry whom you please from amongst the women. 2, 3, and 4. Tell me, which women are being spoken about? The widows of the orphans. The mothers of the orphans. Are you with me? Are you with me? Are you sure? Look at what the context is. We have created you from a single haqiqah. Be careful of your duties towards your relationships and your familial relationships and your societal relationships. War occurs, disease occurs. Fathers are going to die, parents are going to die. It's possible that there can be a ravaged society, sadly, where there's a rise of orphans. You are duty bound to look after their needs, not just if you marry orphans. Are you duty bound to look after the orphans of the ummah just because you marry them? No. We're duty bound to look after the orphans because they are the orphans of the ummah. So be careful of your duty and how you look after the wealth of the orphans. Bring them up in the ways in which they need. Housing, schooling, emotional support, whatever they need, you are duty bound to look after them. And if you fear that the community does not act equitably towards them and they have needs, do what? Marry their mothers. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Do you understand? فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. Which nisa? Ya nisa. Generally all nisa? No. Ahsantum. The widows from amongst the orphans. You see, if there's 3 orphans here and there's a wife, she's a widow. She could be 60 years old. She could be 40 years old. And look, you know better than me, back in the day, 1400 years ago, when you're talking about a widow, did she have education? Did she have means to be able to start her own life? So, by priority, if there are needs for the young girls, the young aitam, by priority, who's also going to have needs? The mothers. Ahsan, the widows. So if you marry the orphans, who's going to be left behind? The mothers. So you have an orphan here, you have an orphan there, you have an orphan there. And what does it say? Look after your arham. You're going to have cousins. You're going to have a wider family unit. They will have lost fathers in war. You will have 3 women, 2 women, 3 women, 2 women in your family. They are widows. They have children. Marry them. Marry the widows from amongst the nisa. And if you need it to be, then marry how many? 1, 2, 3. Ahsantum, jazakumullah khair. Have you understood? This is the difference in tafsir. So now go back to the issues at hand. Number 1. The first issue was what? There was no limitations upon men prior to Islam. This verse, they say, gives a general limitation that you're supposed to be marrying 1, 2, 3, or 4. If you read the verse in the way in which we just explained it, the verse is not giving you general permission to marry 2, 3, or 4 women. It's not. It's specifically telling you to marry which women, 2, 3, or 4? Widows only. It's not giving you a general permission, go marry anyone from Afghanistan, go and marry someone from Pakistan, go and have 3 wives over there, 1 wife over here, bring them back when you want, go travel there for 6 months of the year. It's not saying that. The ayah does not tell you that, according to the second reading. According to the first reading, it does. You can have 4 wives. Second reading is no. Whom is specifically being told you can marry? Widows only. Widows only. So the first issue, no limitations on Arab men prior to Islam, brings it down to 4. Does it do that? Yes or no? It doesn't. No, it doesn't. If it's a general permission in the first reading, then it's general permission. In the second reading, does it bring it down to 4? No. It's 4, ahsant, conditioned to widows. Do you understand? Are you following? I'm not saying that the other ahadith don't give. I remember I said I'm not discussing hadith. I'm just discussing this ayah for now. So regard to issue number 1. Does it give general permission in our reading? No, it's not general permission. It's specifically to 4 wives, meaning widows, when they are in need. So is it a limitation on 4 in general? No, it's not, number 1. Second issue. When you see that the context of the 3 ayat is talking about arham, when it's talking about the issues of how yatama become yatim, how they end up becoming yatim, as we said in Afghanistan, there's because of war, in Syria, because of war, in Palestine, because of war. And if you fear that you cannot act equitably towards orphans, it doesn't say if you can't marry them properly. It just says if you're not able to support them, if the social system is not supportive of the orphans, fankihu, marry and nisa, the widows from amongst those orphans. Second issue. What was the third issue that we raised? The issue of the word yatama versus yatimat. Can you see? In the first reading, Sayyid Tabatabai and others, they've relegated the whole meaning of the verse to yatimat. He only talks about, but are there not boys who are also yatim? Yes or no? Yes. So where are they? If you think that the verse is only about marriage to girls, then you're only answering through girls. But a boy is also made yatim. So what does the verse say? If you cannot deal justly with orphans in the general sense, the need of orphan boys as well as orphan girls, do what? Marry their mothers. Can you see? Fourth problem that we raised with the ayah was what? If you read it in the first way that Sayyid Tabatabai and others have claimed, what does the verse encourage you to do? Not marry the young girls, instead marry 4 other random women. What was the consequence of that, we said? You're leaving all these girls without help, without support. Is that what the Quran wants from you? In the second reading, does it do that? No. In fact, it gives you the social support. It makes them have a father figure again, doesn't it? If you can't act equitably, if there's no social system to look after the yatima or the yatim, marry the mother, you become the father figure over that yatim. And how many can you marry? 1, 2, 3, or 4. Khalas. Subhanallah. All of a sudden, the whole issue changes on its head. Why is this important? Can you see? Previously, every mufassir was explaining this verse through the issue of marriage. We are not. We're explaining it as a means of a social support system for yatim. You see the difference? Sayyid Tabatabai and the others, what are they saying? Marriage, if you can't marry an orphan girl and you don't think you can look after her properties and you're going to mix it with your own and it's going to be dhulm upon them, leave them. Don't marry them, marry 4 others. You're free to be able to marry 4 women that you want. What's the focus? What's the lens that he's looking at tafsir from? Marriage. And in whose favor? Is it helping orphans? No. Who's it helping? You as men. How many wives do you get, mashallah? 4. Do you understand my point? The whole focus of their tafsir is what? Men's needs, man's needs. Man gets 4 wives. Of course women are going to complain when you read this way of the tafsir. Of course. What is the way we are presenting it? Allah is saying, sadly, in communities, orphans sometimes are created en masse. There needs to be a social system that looks after all of their needs. Housing, education, clothing, emotional, social support systems. What does the Quran say? وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ, if you fear, أَنْ لَا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى, if you fear that you cannot support them as they deserve to be supported, if you fear a shortcoming on that, فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُمْ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ, marry the widows from amongst them. So that they're not left behind. So that they're not left alone. They have a social support system. If the social support system isn't there, you intervene and support them by marrying their mothers. So what's the focus of the ayah? The yatim. The support of the yatim. Tell me, which one do you think the Quran is more interested in? Be honest. Man getting 4 wives or a whole social system in supporting of aitam? Which one? Same question. The name of the surah is Surah An. Do you think the Surah An-Nisa is more interested in man getting 4 wives or in the needs of widows? Ahsantum, barakallahu feekum. I don't know how they've come out with this tafsir. May Allah bless them. I don't know how. And how you have been spoilt in your minds to think that this verse is giving you a permission of 4 wives. Where have you got this from? Where have you got this from? For 1400 years, people have been telling you that this is the verse telling you that you get 4 wives. It's not telling you get 4 wives. It's saying if there is an urgent need in society because of aitam, do your bit and marry 1 or 2 widows or 3 widows or khalas. But the moment you start to look at it through the ideal of man's whims and man's pleasures and man's desires, you change the meaning of the ayah. And you say the whole verse is about men. The whole surah is called Suratan Khalas. So is it going to be about the needs of women or the needs of man? In the context of widows, who's it going to be about? Women or men? Women. Khalas. But this is what happens when we do tafsir like this. So, many times this verse is very misunderstood. Very, very misunderstood. May Allah bless the Mufassirin for all their good efforts. I am suggesting to you, you don't have to agree, you can disagree. I am suggesting to you the meaning of this verse is not about men, it is about widows. And I'm suggesting to you it doesn't give carte blanche for wives. I'm not saying that man can't marry 4 wives. I said that's another issue for a hadith. I'm telling you about this ayah. I'm saying in this ayah, the verse does not appear to be able to give carte blanche permission for 4 wives. It's talking in the context of widows and encouraging you to marry a maximum of 4 widows to be able to support the orphans of your community. What does this do? This resolves the issues that outside the Muslim world many people throw at the Muslims and say, oh, polygamy, this, that. This ayah, inside the Muslim world, where many women, especially in this modern day, are saying, what does this mean about polygamy? It again appears to be able to resolve the issue that this verse is not encouraging man just to have 4 wives or up to 4 wives. It's encouraging looking after widows where is necessary. Therefore, it resolves both the issues from external to the Muslim Ummah and also internal to the Muslim Ummah. I reiterate that I'm not saying that it's not permissible to have 4 wives. I'm saying that's another issue for another time. I'm talking about only whether this verse talks about that issue in its general sense. Let me ask you this last question. How many wives did the Holy Prophet Muhammad al-Mustafa sallallahu alayhi wa alayhi have? Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. How many at one time? So at one point it was 1, and then he had several more, 9, 11 at one time. When he made those marriages, what was the purpose of those marriages? Ahsant. The whole context was what? Either widows or spreading the faith and marrying into tribes so that tribes will come back to Islam, the unity of the Ummah. Look at this verse. The whole thing is about the socialized system of Islam. Did the Prophet marry 4 or 7 or 9 on the basis of whims and desires? So where do we get the idea that this is what Islam allows? Can you see? Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib salawatullah wa salamuhu alayh. The principle was again 1 wife. The Prophet was married to Lady Khadija alayha salam. Amir al-Mu'mineen is married to Lady Fatima alayha salam. After her martyrdom, salamullahi alayha, then he marries more. On the premise of what? What's the famous reason to marry Lady Fatima al-Kilabiyya? To bring home Ahsantum. Can you see? Look at the principle the verse is saying. It's about the social needs of the community. This is when it's permitted to marry 2 or encouraged to marry 2 or 3 or 4. It's not carte blanche, is it, in the ayah? We're arguing. And then even if you match it to the sunnah of the Prophet and the sunnah of Amir al-Mu'mineen, which one is it? Is it a free hand? Or is it in the context of supporting widows, supporting orphans, supporting the movement of Islam? Which one? Ahsantum. So here, inshallah, this has given you something to think about. I leave it to you as to which one you agree with, disagree with. You're free to ask Mufassirin, free to read Tafasir, free to ask Maulana. But I'm giving to you the 2 major opinions, the more historical, traditional one, and the more contemporary one, and the way in which we resolve the matter. Inshallah, this helps us in our understanding of why this verse suggests marrying 2, 3, or 4. والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلي يا ربي على خيرتك من خلقك محمد وآله الطاهرين. It's only fair if there are any questions. I'll do my best to try to answer or resolve them. I'm sure the sisters may also have questions. So, sisters are very happy, as they should be. Sure. Can I answer that first? So the question, I won't use the word wrong. I'll say that there's two differing opinions as to whether it's a general permission of marriage for or a specific recommendation of marriage of for. I will argue it's a specific recommendation of for widows. Yeah? But the answer is that they have seen this verse through the lens of marriage and the hadith that says that people came to the Prophet and complained about the difficulty. I would argue there are many difficulties in religion. Doesn't mean that immediately the Quran goes and absolves you of those difficulties. I would have suggested that the Prophet will say, well, if there's a difficulty of you how to be able to deal with the property of orphans, this is how you need to grow, become more precise. It's not a reason not to marry an orphan. So I think that they've added 2 and 2 and gotten 5 here. They've taken the verse in isolation and viewing it through the lens of marriage, as opposed to the sequence, which is looking at it through the lens of yatim, aitam. And as a result of looking at it through the lens of marriage, they're now translating it and saying, this is telling you that if you can't get married to an orphan because it's difficult for you, marry 2, 3, 4, or marry to 1, 2, 3, or 4. That's how they've made that category error, because they're focusing on one verse and not 3, and they're looking at it through the lens of marriage and not supporting yatim as a social system of welfare. Yeah, blood relatives. From your family. So I believe verse 1, no, so verse 1 starts, Ya ayyuhan nas. So it starts with the universal. And the surah is about women, and the whole thing starts about an-nas, and then it goes into the various issues. You have your relationships with your wives, you have your relationships with your arham, and then you have your relationship with your society. In that context, you're going to find orphans who are in need, take care of their various different needs. If you fear that you cannot be equitable to them, one of the ways to look after them is marry their mothers. 1, 2, 3, or 4. Yes, exactly. I think this is, I think that because they focused on the topic of marriage so heavily, it has skewed the reading of the 3 verses. But again, it's because tafsir evolves. It's not their fault. And I'm not saying it as a blameworthy or as an undermining to them. They could be right and I could be wrong. And I'm not saying, wow, look at me, or look at the other mufassirin. I'm not saying I'm a mufassir. So mufassirin have come at these angles. Tafsir is always evolving. Our understanding of these issues are ever evolving. Every ayah continues to evolve. It's not new. The major marja that has come with this view of looking at the siyaq of the ayah and says that the lens is not marriage, the lens is social structure and welfare for aitam, is Ayatollah Sayyid Kamal al-Haydari of Qom. Which makes sense to me when you zoom out of the verse and go to the whole surah. that the whole surah is about women's needs or the principle of women. So why are we looking at the verse through the lens of the needs of men? Doesn't make sense to me. Sisters, there's no comment, no. Yeah, if there's any, please, sisters, please knock on the door or ask any questions, feel free. Their mothers, who are the widows.
So what happens if their mothers are dead?
Yeah, so you can, the issue is, let's step away from the issue of marriage. We are arguing that the sequence of the verses is talking about all the ways that you need to help women and children. In the context of the 3 verses, it's talking about orphans. How do you help orphans? A whole social structure to support, right? We build special schools for orphans in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, correct? We make sure that they're looked after as best as possible. We make sure there's no social stigma, that they don't feel like they're being sort of, because they're orphaned. You know, like we make sure that every emotional support is in need. 2 weeks ago when we had the brother coming in to represent that charity about the prosthetics, he's like, you've got orphans in Palestine because of the bombs, they've lost limbs. What do we need to do to support orphans in Gaza, specifically in Gaza? Help them with their limbs. We need to give them prosthetics for their arms and their legs, give them wheelchairs. That's a specific need in Gaza that probably is a little bit different to Iraq, isn't it? In Iraq, there are orphans. In Gaza, there are orphans, but the need is slightly different. So you need to have a whole social system to look after them. If you fear that you do not look after them and there's no support, marry their mothers. That's the meaning. That's what we're arguing is the meaning. So it's not about marriage. The principle is about social welfare, one of which is marriage to their mothers. I can't speak on behalf of other faiths and other faith texts, but I do imagine that here in the UK there is generally a very good system, social system for orphans and for child support, for, what's the word when you, fostering. Yeah, I think there's quite a good support system in place. This is what I believe the Quran is pointing to in these sets of verses. Ahsant, more than everybody else, mashallah. Thank you so much to my young brothers with their questions and to the young sisters as well. If there's any questions later on from the sisters, then feel free to speak to us outside or another day. Inshallah, we'll do our best to be able to answer. Please raise your hand, join me in dua. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to understand the Quran better. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to help us to implement the Quran better. And we ask you, Ya Allah, to hasten the appearance of Imam al-Mahdi alayhi salam and to help all those orphans around the world however we can support them inshaAllah. Walhamdulillah Rabbil Alameen wa salli ya Rabbi ala Muhammadin wa alihi at-tahirin. Please conclude this discussion with a Surah Al-Fatiha for the marhumin of the sponsors of tonight's Iftar. Al-Fatiha. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Our dear sponsors tonight is Sayyid Ghazanfar and his wife, and so for the Surah Al-Fatiha was for their marhumeen. Jazakumullah khair. We're going to start our Quran Khani Darsa, so for those who have opportunity to stay and recite Quran, we'll be setting up here inshaAllah. Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad.